Hey Bulbasaur, if brains were leaves, you'd still be the same size. You're the kind of Pokemon that makes a Magikarp look like a strategic genius. Your biggest achievement is making people wonder if you're a walking salad or just a really confused frog. And seriously, for a plant Pokemon, you'd think you'd have bloomed into something impressive by now, but nope, still stuck as a bulb. I guess the only thing evolving about you is your ability to stay irrelevant. Ivysaur, congrats on evolving from Bulbasaur to slightly bigger Bulbasaur. You're like the awkward teenage phase that everyone just wants to skip over. With those leaves, you look like a bad attempt at camouflage in a garden. You're a halfway Pokemon, halfway to being useful and halfway to being forgotten. And what's with that flower bud on your back? It's like you're carrying your own bad haircut. Face it, even Caterpie gets more excitement for evolving, and that's saying something. Venusaur, you might be the final evolution, but you're still just a glorified houseplant with legs. You're basically a dinosaur that got stuck in a greenhouse and decided to stay there. Your flower may be in full bloom, but your personality is still wilting. You're so slow that by the time you get to the battle, everyone's already gone home. And let's be honest, nobody's picking you for speed or charm, they just feel bad for you because you're the original starter. Face it, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a lawn ornament, big, bulky, and mostly ignored. Charmander, you call that a flame on your tail? I've seen candles with more firepower. You're like a lizard that someone forgot to put batteries in. You think you're all hot stuff, but let's be real, you're just a glorified campfire waiting to be put out by a Squirtle. Your biggest talent is making trainers regret not picking Bulbasaur or Squirtle. Even Team Rocket doesn't bother with you, they know you're just a pre-evolved has-been. Face it, Charmander, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a matchstick, useful for about 10 seconds, then forgotten. Charmeleon, you're basically Charmander with an attitude problem. You think you're cool because you've got a bit more fire, but you're still just an overgrown salamander with a temper tantrum. You're stuck in that awkward phase where you're too weak to be a real threat and too old to be cute. Your biggest accomplishment is evolving into something that still gets overshadowed by literally every other fire type. Honestly, you're just the filler episode of Pokemon Evolutions, no one really cares, and everyone's just waiting for the next stage. Face it, Charmeleon, you're the moody teenager of the Pokemon world, and even your flames can't hide your mediocrity. Charizard, you might think you're the king of fire types, but let's be honest, you're just a dragon wannabe who couldn't even get the dragon typing right. You're basically a glorified flying lizard with a midlife crisis. You've got wings, but you still can't escape the fact that you're just a nostalgia trip for 90s kids. Your biggest move is, look at me, I can breathe fire. Big deal, we've seen more impressive stuff from a flamethrower TM. And don't even get me started on your Mega Evolution phases, it's like watching a washed-up rock star trying to stay relevant with costume changes. Face it, Charizard, the only thing legendary about you is how overrated you've become. Squirtle, you think you're all that with your sunglasses and water gun, but let's be real, you're just a turtle with a squirt gun. Your biggest talent is making people wish they picked Bulbasaur or Charmander instead. You're the kind of Pokemon that gets mistaken for a bath toy. That shell on your back. It's not protection, it's your mobile home because you're too slow to keep up with everyone else. Even Magikarp laughs at your combat skills, and that's saying something. Face it, Squirtle, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a water balloon, fun for a moment, but easily forgotten. Wartortle, you're like Squirtle's awkward older brother who never quite grew out of his rebellious phase. That fluffy tail and ear wings? They make you look like a rejected mascot for a kid's water park. You're stuck in the middle evolution limbo, too big to be cute and too weak to be cool. Your biggest achievement is making people impatient for blasters. You think you're intimidating, but let's be honest, you're just a slightly angrier Squirtle. Face it, Wartortle, you're the middle child of the Pokemon world, overlooked, underwhelming, and just a stepping stone to something better. Blasters, you might have those big cannons on your back, but let's be honest, you're just compensating for something. You're basically a turtle that took a wrong turn at a military base. You think you're all tough, but deep down, you know you're just a Squirtle who hit the gym too hard. Your hydro pump? It's more like a glorified garden hose. And let's not forget, you're so slow that by the time you waddle into battle, everyone else has already won. Face it, Blasters, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a water cooler, bulky, updated, and only good for a brief moment of refreshment. Caterpie, you're like the rejected extra from a bug-themed horror movie. Your biggest claim to fame is being the Pokemon everyone catches first and then immediately forgets about. Your string shot move. It's more like a tangled mess of disappointment. You're so weak that even Metapod looks at you and thinks, step up, buddy. And those eyes of yours? They are like two tiny dots staring into the void of irrelevance. Face it, Caterpie, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a warm-up exercise, barely noticeable and easily squashed. Metapod, you're like the Pokemon version of a cocoon disappointment. Your entire strategy revolves around hardening, which is ironic because emotionally, you're as fragile as tissue paper. Your biggest move is harden, but let's face it, you're about as threatening as a pillow fight. You spend most battles just hanging there, waiting to evolve into something marginally more useful. And those eyes? They've seen more boredom than a slowpoke on a rainy day. Face it, Metapod, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a timeout, everyone just waits for you to finish so they can get on with something more interesting. Butterfree, you're like the Pokemon that tried to be beautiful but ended up looking like a rejected butterfly costume. Your wings? They are less majestic and more like a flimsy cape made of tissue paper. Your biggest claim to fame is being the bug Pokemon that everyone catches just to fill up their pokes and then promptly forgets about. And that sleep powder move of yours? It's less hypnotic and more like a gentle breeze that puts opponents to sleep out of sheer boredom. Face it, Butterfree, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a fleeting summer romance, pretty to look at for a moment, but easily replaced by something more substantial. Weedle, you're like the insect nobody asked for, a walking, talking needle with eyes. Your claim to fame is being the Pokemon that everyone accidentally steps on in the Viridian Forest. Those tiny stingers on your head? They are more like a mild inconvenience than a threat. And let's talk about your Poison Sting move, it's less poisonous and more like a tickle from a feather duster. Face it, Weedle, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a minor annoyance, easy to swat away and quickly forgotten. Kakuna, you're like the Pokemon that hit the snooze button on evolution and never woke up. Your entire existence is just hanging there, waiting for something interesting to happen. Your defense mechanism, Harden, is as exciting as watching paint dry. You're like the caterpillar that got halfway through metamorphosis and then decided to take a nap. And those beady eyes of yours? They've seen more trainers yawn than battles won. Face it, Kakuna, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a traffic cone, sturdy, but utterly useless unless someone needs to navigate around you. Beedrill, you think you're so menacing with those giant stingers, but let's be real, you're just an overgrown wasp with an attitude problem. Your entire strategy is to buzz around annoyingly and hope someone gets scared. Your Twin Needle move? It's like getting poked by two slightly sharp pencils. You're the kind of Pokemon that gives bug types a bad name, more irritating than intimidating. And let's not forget, your wings look like they are made out of plastic wrap. Face it, Beedrill, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a bad summer picnic, full of stings and best avoided. Pidgey, you're like the common cold of the Pokemon world, everyone encounters you, and no one's impressed. You think you're special because you can whip up a little gust of wind? Please, even a light breeze puts up more of a fight. Your claim to fame is being the most boring encounter in the tall grass. And let's talk about your appearance, you're basically a glorified pigeon with a bad haircut. Your biggest achievement is being the first Pokemon trainers catch and then immediately box. Face it, Pidgey, you're the Pokemon equivalent of background noise, always there, never interesting. Pidgeotto, you might think you're a step up from Pidgey, but let's face it, you're just a slightly bigger pigeon with an inflated ego. Your attempts at looking fierce with that tuft of feathers are about as convincing as a cat in a lion costume. Your Whirlwind move? It's less of a tornado and more of a mild inconvenience, like a fan set on low. You're stuck in that awkward middle stage where you're not cute like Pidgey and not impressive like Pidgeot. Face it, Pidgeotto, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a mid-tier sidekick, neither memorable nor missed when you're gone. Pidgeot, you might have those majestic wings and a regal look, but let's be honest, you're just a fancy pigeon with a superiority complex. Your Hurricane move? More like a mild gust compared to real powerhouses. You're the kind of Pokemon that tries to be a legend but ends up as a footnote. Your speed might be impressive, but even with all that speed, you can't outrun how forgettable you are. And that Mirror move? Just a fancy way of saying you copy others because you lack originality. Face it, Pidgeot, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a flashy sports car, nice to look at but easily outclassed by true legends. Rattata, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a pesky rodent, always around, always annoying. Your biggest claim to fame is being the Zubat of the ground, constantly popping up when no one wants you. Your Hyper Fang move? It's more like a slightly aggressive nibble. You think you're tough with those big teeth, but let's face it, you're just a glorified pest. Your purple fur doesn't make you unique, it just makes you look like a rejected cartoon character. Face it, Rattata, you're the Pokemon equivalent of an uninvited guest, constantly showing up where you're not wanted and quickly forgotten. Raticate, you're just a bigger, angrier version of Rattata with teeth that look like they belong in a horror movie. Your Hyperfang might sound intimidating, but it's really just a glorified chomp. Those whiskers? They look like they're trying too hard to be impressive, but end up making you look like a failed science experiment. You think you're tough, but you're basically the Pokemon version of a sewer rat. And let's talk about your speed, quick enough to be annoying, but not enough to be truly effective. Face it, Raticate, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a bad sequel, bigger, louder, and still not worth remembering. Spearow, you're like Pidge's angrier, uglier cousin. Your peck move? It's about as threatening as a toddler with a spoon. You've got an attitude problem, but no real skills to back it up. Your screeching cry isn't intimidating, it's just annoying, like nails on a chalkboard. Your feathers look like they've never seen a good preen, all scruffy and unkempt. And let's be honest, no one is excited to see you pop out of the tall grass. Face it, Spearow, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a bad-tempered pigeon, loud, noxious, and easily brushed aside. Fearow, you might think you're intimidating with that long neck and sharp beak, but let's be honest, you're just a stretched-out Spearow with a bad attitude. Your drill peck move? It's less of a drill and more of an annoying poke. You look like a vulture that missed its calling and ended up in the wrong game. Your attempts to be fierce are about as convincing as a kitten trying to roar. And those wings? They look more like tattered rags flapping in the wind. Face it, Fearow, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a scarecrow, more bark than bite, and easily overlooked for something actually impressive. Ekans, you think you're so sly with your sneaky demeanor, but let's face it, you're just a glorified garden snake. Your name is literally, snake, spelled backward, how creative. Your rap move? It's less of a constricting force and more like an awkward hug. Your biggest claim to fame is being a stepping stone for trainers who want something better. And that hiss of yours? It's more of a weak whistle than a fearsome warning. Face it, Ekans, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a rubber snake, novel for a moment, but ultimately harmless and easily ignored. Arbok, you think you're all that with your intimidating hood and scary face pattern, but let's be honest, you're just Ekans with a growth spurt. Your glare move? It's about as menacing as a stern look from a schoolteacher. You strut around like you're the king of the poison types, but you're really just a fancy noodle with a bad attitude. Your claim to fame is scaring off a few Rattata, big deal. And that hood pattern? It looks more like bad face paint at a kid's party. Face it, Arbok, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a carnival sideshow, flashy, but ultimately not worth the hype. Pikachu, you may be the face of Pokemon, but let's not pretend you're without flaws. Your Thunderbolt move? It's about as shocking as a static electricity zap. Your cuteness might have carried you through, but honestly, you're just a glorified mascot with a severe case of electrification. Your quick attack? More like a slightly hastened stroll. And those cheeks of yours? They are not even useful for storing electricity, they are just chubby. Face it, Pikachu, you're the Pokemon equivalent of a pop star whose fame has outlasted their talent. Also, you're a cunt.